Welcome, Anne, to Mujer Latina Today.
Hi, I'm Ann Golden. I'm with Xavier University, and my area is intercultural communication. So what I'll talk about today, there'll be a thread of cross-cultural communication woven in. Well, let me give a little context for personal brand management. Let me talk about brand management briefly to give this a context. So everybody knows what a brand is, but if you think about brand management, it encompasses a lot of different aspects. So, for example, think about your favorite product. I'll talk about one of mine. It's more of a service than a product. I subscribe to Netflix, and there are other options out there for subscribing to videos, but I love Netflix because for me it's all about convenience. So it's really easy to subscribe to it. They have lots of selections. So for me, the brand Netflix stands for convenience. So that's one example. So thinking about personal brand management, it's really about, at the end of the day, what do you stand for? When people think of you, what do they think about? So maybe they don't think convenience, that's more of a product or a service, but maybe they think she's reliable, she's somebody you can count on for X, Y, and Z. A person's culture comes into consideration because when you're working or living in another culture, you always have to think about how does this translate across cultures. So, for example, a few minutes ago, you and I were talking about somebody who was interviewed who came across as very calm, and I was thinking to myself, well, in the Midwest, that would translate in a certain kind of way, and maybe for the Latino audience, that would come across as slightly more boring, lacking energy, etc. And it just made me think about, well, how does that translate? So I think we always have to think about the cross-cultural piece. What does that look like to people coming from a different perspective? Now, of course, we have lots of individual differences, and we can't say everybody in Latin America thinks this, but there are certain things we can generalize. And so when we're trying to create an image or a brand for ourselves, we always have to think about how will that be viewed in another culture. So thinking about Latinos in this country trying to be successful at work and really carve out a niche for themselves, I would say it's really worthwhile to think about how does what I'm doing, of course performance is always part of personal brand, it's not just about image, what I'm doing, how I'm coming across to people, how does that translate? How will that be viewed here? It might be different, and often it is different.
What is the best way for a Latina to brand themselves?
Well,
or herself in
one of
this
the
case?
things that always comes up, I get questions about this a lot, and I know you've been asked before, people, especially for women, what to wear to work always comes up. It tends to be a big deal because we have a huge range of options compared to men. I think it's about knowing the rules for where you are, and then once you know the rules, and there are certain guidelines, there are things that you can find out by reading up on the topic or talking to people. Once you understand those, you can kind of figure out what's the range of acceptability in that, because it's not always just, okay, here is how everyone has to do it, but here's the range of possibility, and as an individual, what's my range of acceptability in that, and try to understand how I can still feel comfortable and be myself, but not cross the line. So I always encourage people, understand your own personal range, and then try to figure out how is that going to translate.
But don't you think as a Latina, I'm losing a little bit of my personality? Do I need to do that to have my personal branding?
Well, I'm a big believer in just understand how it will probably come across. That's the first step. And once you understand how it might translate, you can make decisions based on the context, and figure out what's acceptable within that range, and then just be aware. And sometimes to do exactly what you would do at home comes with a big risk here. So I'm a big believer in knowing how that will play out, how will that be perceived, because it's not the same context.
What about for others who are working across cultures? What do they need to keep in mind?
I think the most important thing is to get in the habit of looking at yourself from a totally different perspective. And whatever you think is kind of this set image of how you come across, and again, we're not talking just about clothing, it's also behavior. You know, you think that it's this permanent thing, this is how I am, this is how people perceive me, but it's not the same in a different environment. It's not going to be the same, and so I think you always have to be kind of open-minded to how will this come across, and be very, you know, be willing to flex a little bit.
In the current economy, shouldn't people be focused on more concrete and more immediate things than one's personal image? Why not just focus on skills, background, education, for example?
Well, again, I think, you know, giving a little context to this, I mean, personal brand is definitely not just about image. I mean, if you think this is a triangle, for example, at the top would be your performance, what you do, and things like that, your behavior, what, you know, your actions are. So if we're talking about work, your work performance, what you bring to the table. Then over here in this corner would be your image, how are you perceived? And then over here would be exposure, who knows you, who do you know, and things like that. So it's not just those things, but since we are talking about, you know, a couple of pieces of that in particular, why is that important? Well, it's getting more competitive, whether you're competing for a full-time job or just a project. You know, if you're an artist or a consultant, there's more competition than there used to be, and people have to know exactly what you're about, because chances are there are more people than there used to be competing for that same project. So it's really important that people understand, you know, what are you bringing to the table, you know, compared to what she's bringing. So that's why it's important. This is not a frivolous topic, and again, this is not just about clothing. That we could talk easily for hours just about, you know, communication and how you come across, and the power of speech to help people form an impression of you.
How do you think electronic networking tools like LinkedIn and Facebook should be used for managing our personal brand? And what are the dangers, if any, of marketing ourselves this way?
Well, I think dangers come into play when, you know, let's talk about Facebook for a minute. I think Facebook was intended to just be for social networking, but it's evolved into a tool for other kinds of marketing as well. And so I think we have to kind of understand who might be seeing our profile, and if we're not careful about what we put out there, especially photographs and, you know, who we're linked to and so on, it's not that difficult for somebody to see that who really isn't just purely in our social network. You know, there's a lot of overlap now, and people can easily see what you're about, even if you don't invite them in. I mean, there's a certain amount of information that's almost public once you get an account. And so I think we always have to be conscious of not just the primary people who will see this information, but who might see it, and how might that come across, and could that be damaging? What if a potential employer or business partner saw
So you
it?
have like the do's and don'ts.
I would say this is that people might want to err on the side of being a little cautious. You know, I think that a friend of mine, Barbara Diedrichsen, and I talk about this a lot, and Barbara had a really good point. I asked her, what do you think is the difference between Facebook and LinkedIn? Because I said, Barbara, people are using Facebook for professional networking, even if that wasn't the original intention, and I think it's worth talking about what are the boundaries and what do we have to be careful of. And she said, well, Facebook, if you use it for professional networking, is networking with a light touch. And I thought that says it all. And that's what it is. And it's not that we can't have a picture of ourselves with our family or our pets or something like that, but just we have to be aware of who might be seeing that. And, you know, and that's one thing, but do we want to have the pictures on the beach where we're drinking beer and it's all hanging out or something like that? You know, how will that come across? So
Are you coming back soon again?
I hope so, and I want to tell people I really invite questions about this, because some of these things don't have simple answers. Some of them are context related and situation related, and so hopefully people will feel free to.
Do you have a number that they can contact you?
They can write to me, Golden, that's just GOLDEN @Xavier.edu. So I welcome questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure.